Hey world, this is it, the most driven podcast on the radio. Welcome to The Driven, a podcast brought to you by the kick-ass nutrition science team at mDrive. mDrive is all you need and all you need to know in the world of more energy, more focus, more stamina, and more drive. I'm your host, Rick Baroff, longtime ultra-endurance athlete and mDrive ambassador. We're going to talk it up with a wealth of amazing, passionate, dedicated, and driven guys in all walks of life. So get ready to be motivated and inspired. It's The Driven Podcast.
Race fans and hot rodders, this podcast is for you. That's right, we've got all access passes to Pit Row with one of auto racing's top photographers, Tony Zinno. But wait, that's not all, because Tony is also one of the world's best photographers across a number of adventurous avenues, from extreme mountaineering to Hollywood backlots. He's shot for no less than Nike, Adidas, The North Face, Rolling Stone magazine, National Geographic, and several world-changing non-profit organizations. But despite his constant brushes with fame and the intoxicating roar of shooting cars and drivers trackside, Tony is one of the most down-to-earth, conscientious, and intentional people you'll ever meet. He never forgets where he came from, Cleveland, yuck. He always acknowledges his mentors, and he's constantly growing much more than his body of work by recognizing and extending the gratitude he has for doing exactly what he loves at all times. From his first big-time shoots with legendary multisport star Bo Jackson, to the gonzo rock group Spinal Tap, to ascending icy peaks with renowned climbers, Tony not only brings back amazing shots, but is truly an old-fashioned storyteller who brings out the human element in everything he does. The love of story started early thanks to his cinephile parents, and even though his dad was a surgeon and wanted him to get a real job, it was his dad who got him a break by convincing the administrators at the prestigious art center to give his son a chance at pursuing his dreams. The rest is an unfolding treasury of unique and amazing images and tales from one of the most unassuming Zen masters of extreme photography, Tony Zinno. 3, 2, 1. Hello, mDrive Nation. Rick Baroff here again with another episode of The Driven Podcast. Today we are talking with Tony Zinno, an amazing globetrotting photographer, professor. Welcome, Tony. How are you doing?
I'm alive and kicking, Rick. Thanks for having me.
Right on. You know, what's cool is, we've reconnected, or I say connected, whatever you want to say, lately. And I feel like we're very simpatico because we're almost like brothers from another mother. We've been floating in and out of each other's spaces for 2-3 decades now, not to show our ages. We've shaken hands or stumbled across each other, quite literally muddy, and maybe that was it. We were all, in different states of mind and being out in the jungles and around the world. Officially, let's say we just met for the first time. No,
okay.
No.
I can do that.
No, this is great. It's awesome to actually sit down and talk to you about, all the stuff that we have, maybe even done together. So tell us, you have shot for a variety of folks, from Nike on down. What's your background? What's your story?
The snapshot is as a kid who grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Both my folks are from the east and west side, and they're the sons and daughters of immigrants. With my
yeah. I should say I'm from Pittsburgh, so we might have to end this call very quickly. No, I'm just kidding. All right.
Right, the Brown Steelers, there were more fights in the stands than on the field. We'll talk about that. But
we'll talk about that, yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally relate. Another steel town, and Pops, he was from the east side, Mom from the west side, and Mom being Irish and Dad being Italian. So we share the same kind of mix that so many immigrants do in terms of people like Bradley Cooper and Robert De Niro and that kind of stuff. So we're in good company. So growing up in that space, I got to say that my folks had a huge influence on me in terms of what I would become someday, because they both had passions that were sort of wearing on their sleeves. My mom being a cinephile.
All right, awesome, yeah. And your dad was a historian. That's pretty cool. Was it like just a hobby, or was he a professor too, or what?
I think he would have been if he had changed his career. He ended up being a surgeon, so he ended up as an MD. But he had another minor in history, and his specialty was World War II and the fascist era. And the library that I grew up in was a combination of war photography and history, and of course Hollywood in the golden era on the silver screen.
Right on.
And sometimes those things strangely overlap, but it's certainly visually. I was sort of initiated by some of the greatest photographers from Hollywood. If you want to talk photo history, like Clarence Bull and George Lange, and then the first hero I knew in photography was the great Robert Capa, who co-founded Magnum.
Oh yeah,
Greatest of the great, right? And so these things were playing on me from the earliest age. In fact, in all disclosure, in full transparency, I'll confess, I'll be the first person to tell you that I'm a post-literate kid, which is that because of this sort of intense love affair with not just movies, but magazines, and those magazines would be like the Pictorials in Life, or even better, Nat Geo. Those things were my, ongoing continuing education as a kid. And it wasn't until I was in college, really, that I got around to reading the serious classics and this kind of stuff. So, yeah, that's a snapshot of my childhood. I had a dad who thought he was like kind of Humphrey Bogart, my mom who thought she was German, and I'm the progeny of that, right?
All right. No, that's great. So, I mean, storytelling, and that's what you do, obviously through photography, and, people shoot, obviously a lot of people shoot video, or you help people do projects these days. So, yeah, you got to know the story to be able to even shoot a photo, like what are you telling people in there?
Yeah, storytelling runs in my family. Is probably one of the secrets to, if you stop and think long enough, why you do what you do. Back in the analog day, my dad had picked up a camera from his time in Vietnam, where he was a Navy surgeon, and happened to be a Nikon F. I don't know if you've ever held a Nikon F in your hands, but you could pound hammers and nails with it. It's just brilliant. It's heavy duty, and the 105 lens was legendary. And he would shoot Kodachrome, and the payoff for that was that we would sit in the dark at home with these slideshows on Kodachrome. Wow. And so we had sort of this cinematic experience of our own family growing up. We could see ourselves in imagery. And so it's a really intimate thing that I think is missing largely from the digital experience, where you have that kind of immersive, collective family thing. And so that, is kind of, once you sort of sink your teeth into that, it's almost addictive, because it's very powerful. To see yourself in the pictures and to have that nostalgia driven by sort of these historic landmarks in your life. So I don't think there was any other choices for me, man. It was predetermined in some ways.
Yeah, no, I fought it for a long time, like the analog to digital, because you're like, you can you can lose stuff, but it's better. And obviously there's pluses and minuses. The pluses, you get to literally look at what you have, immediately and say, did I get the shot or not? Do I need to take it again? I mean, obviously there's lots of moments that you do which are instantaneous and are never going to happen again, but you get the idea. Like, you're shooting cars on a track and you think you got something, and you can at least do that rather than running down to the photo mat like we used to, dropping it off.
I haven't heard that in a long time, the photo mat.
Oh, we love the photo mat. I mean, just the awesome surprise of when you came the next day or 2 days later and picked it up. That was
it was like being a kid on Christmas. If you behaved well, you got a gift, and if you were terrible, you got coal in your stocking.
Yeah. I still thought it was like magic too. It's like you're dropping stuff off at the magic box. It's like, how do they do that? I mean, you inherently know, but you're like, they really do all this work in this little tiny hut where they can't even turn around. I guess they send it out, but you get the idea. If anybody still, I think a lot, some folks out there remember driving down to the photo mat with that roll going. I hope the party stuff was, the birthday party was in focus.
It's so important you mentioned that, because it's like, we tend to shoot what we love, and it's like you have twins, right? And you sent me a great shot of the twins on the pumpkin patch. I mean, that's really where it's at. If you're actually holding on to an image of your beloved, I mean, to me, that's the heart of photography, as the spirit of it. And so the question really is, if I were to share with you, for example, in the photojournalism class I teach now at Mount St. Mary's University, I've only got 12 weeks to initiate these guys. Now they're coming from grad film and documentary, and some of them are writers working on social justice, so they're all passionate. But if they've never actually dedicated themselves to photography or working with cameras, man, I've got to actually give them something that they can go away from after a semester and build on it. And so thought long and hard about it, and one of the best things I could do for them is in my experience co-teaching with a lot of different people of a variety. One of whom is a lady named Sarah Terry, who's a member emeritus of 7 Photo, and she's brave and she's fierce and everything. But in working with her, I remember she said, "Look, you got to say, one, what are you looking at?
Yeah.
Are you passionate about it? Are you curious or interested? 2, where are you standing in relationship to this subject? Do you have permission and access and cooperation? 3, when do you shoot?
Yeah.
And 4, do you experience anything? Does it operate on you? Do you have a feeling? Do you come away with, and does it show? Does it communicate without you being there to explain it?" And I got to tell you, that's something I've tried to instill in my young Jedis.
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
The least that they take away from the class, that they could apply that to sort of a criteria of excellent decision making, when they're approaching their own subjects. And hopefully those subjects are passion driven. I mean, this whole podcast is kind of an honor to be asked, because you're collecting. I mean, you're curating. And I really admire that in you, Rick, because that's an ongoing seeking of wisdom and knowledge, right? And to me, that's really an admirable thing, that you're exemplifying that, looking to what things other people know that you don't, and seeing how you can share that. I think that's just great.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. We try to impart some knowledge, get folks, motivated and inspired, of course. And just, as they say, it's called the Driven Podcast. We're trying to get people driven to, just pursue their goals, their dreams, their visions, even if it's, the smallest thing, just, changing their little routine, as it were. It's all good. So speaking of that, you shoot racing now, but, when you're growing up, what did you tell folks what you dreamed about?
I tried to put together like 20 years or more of my career for a lecture, and I went back to the earliest photos I had actually put film in a camera, and you might remember the Brownie, which I took a 120 roll, and it was a waist finder with one little tiny prism, and it's a box this big, super, super cool. And the first frames out of the first roll of that camera I shot was of my kid brother, and he's got a leather football helmet on, and he's holding the football, and I'm like, that's the same shot I did of Deion Sanders for Nike. I'm like,
wow, okay.
So many years and still doing the same thing of like out of reflex. And, it's kind of like, can you draw a line in terms of the trajectory of sort of the dreams of a kid and the intention of those sort of dreams. And one of the things that's in there is this little Polaroid of 2 race cars I got on Christmas, and I was probably 9 or 8, 10 years old. And there's something to be said for that, because these are kind of like seeds that you plant in the imagination. And to the extent that a kid has power to fulfill those things, despite all the obstacles, is really quite something. So, if I started dreaming about being a race car driver, it's because I had, this collision of crossroads where my uncle took me to my first Grand Prix when I was 12.
Oh, okay.
And never before seen a race, had no idea what I was getting into. It happened to be the halcyon golden year of 1976, where Hunt versus Lauda was on, and that's what Ron Howard made his film on for Rush. So if you have ever seen that film, to be a kid in the heart of that, in one of the most epic, legendary years of the sport, it was something that changed the course of my life, honestly, because it became, how close can I get to that thing that holds so much magic.
That's awesome, and it's obviously driven you to the upper echelons and the literally the pits. I mean, you get to hang out at some of the coolest, biggest races around, which is awesome. We'll get there, but I think first of all, despite dreams, that we may have and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I know that my first 800 million photos were as they say, crap, and whatnot. So when did you actually say, okay, I'm gonna try this out or dedicate myself to this crap?
Okay, imagine this. Life magazine had an Olympic preview issue, and back in the day, you can figure out how my vintage. I'm the same age as Brad Pitt and Keanu Reeves, so that tells you that it's probably.
Right. I'll go to my People magazine. I'll check it out.
So having said that, there was the Olympic preview issue, and I opened it up. And now I was 8 years old.
Okay.
And the reason I recall that is that there were images of Mark Spitz in the Schwimm Hall in Munich. And they were full bleed and impossibly beautiful. And in fact, at 8, Now, it's not that I was terribly precocious, but I recognized this photographer is doing something radical. I mean, it was above and beyond the average generic content provider. It was something, his signature that at 8, I'm like, who's this guy? And his name was Co Rentmeester. Co is a Dutchman who ended up shooting the very first pictures of Jordan, by the way, for Nike. Cool. And he's an icon. But at 8 years old, before I had access to the internet, obviously, I'm like, who is this guy? What is he doing? Is there a path that I can emulate? And sure enough, the bio I found and I'm 8, right? So I was driven to find who this guy is, what's he doing. And it turns out he differed from other photographers in that he went to this school called the Art Center College of Design. Now, that must have made an impression on me at 8 because I ended up going there.
All right.
And it's just one of those things where, the timing of it, I arrived at the same time that his daughter, Amy, who went on to become Amy Rentmeester, became quite a fashion photographer. But the fact that it was sort of following that example of what was it that was recognizable, significant of his signature that had some artful artist hand in the process, right? And so I have a debt of gratitude to Co Rentmeester precisely because of that impact those images had on me. And I would give him credit for that because it definitely drove me towards that path of the art school at Art Center. And that's where I ended up teaching for 10 years.
You were precocious in this regard, like you knew what you wanted to do and you were pursuing it at that time. But was it, like in high school or something, or was it actually when you got to that school when you were like, okay, this is it, I'm going for this? And did you have a plan B? Did you have any plan B? You're going to be a surgeon like your dad?
No plan B, man. It was all or none in that respect, and then sort of total commitment. But the true story, at the risk of being self-deprecating, is that I had, as the first son of a first son as 3 generations of expectations. I was likely supposed to follow my dad's footsteps and become a professional and so on. And even if I had the aptitude and the potential to do that, I resisted. And so, the extent of my rebellion was to basically quit school. If you can imagine, I was 3 years into an undergrad degree for psychology, and I just couldn't see myself doing that. And the pull of photography definitely weighed on me. And so my big rebellion was to say, I can't do it. There's no way. And so I dropped out of San Diego State University. And this same uncle who took me to my first Grand Prix says, hey man, have you ever heard of the Art Center? And that may have called back that original connection. And since that, my favorite uncle Tom was, an ad agency exec. He had peers and colleagues who were from this school, and introduced me, and it just kind of connected the dots in a way I hadn't before. Cool. And so when I went in for an interview, you show your portfolio and the whole thing, and I didn't have the grades for it, man, because I had dropped out, So imagine the chair of the photo department says to me, so if I call your father, what's he going to tell me? Are you going to commit? And literally my whole future rested on that call. And I said, oh yeah, call the man. So the chair called my dad on the phone as I sat there. And my dad said, yeah, give the man a chance. And so it happened, and I got in, and thank goodness it was the right place for me, and made the most of it. If you've ever seen Whiplash with Damien Chazelle, Miles Teller plays that prodigy, a young drummer. And where they're dealing in, performing arts, we were definitely in the same culture, but in visual arts. So the critique can be kind of intimidating when you have old school. And I mean old school. The old fellas there were more than a generation ahead of us. And as such, we're pretty intimidating. And that was something that if you've seen that film, you know how intense it is, and you wonder out loud, is this a good thing to be such a strict or driven teacher? And is this abuse if you're that difficult or that stringent? And so as a teacher myself, of course, we try and take the best of those lessons in terms of being exacting, honest, and deliberate. And so there's a very high standard that was involved in that respect. And so the teachers who were my teachers when I began as a young instructor, they were still there, man. I was the new kid stepping into that. And so again, it kind of raises your game to you speak about mentors. I always found that, and it's something I thought about before we came on. So I really wanted to mention to you the sort of the challenge I give my young students is that it's their job, their mission to continue to find the best teachers they can find in or out of school.
Nice. Yeah. So you made it through thanks to your dad. That's awesome. And so I'm sure everybody wants to know what was your first gig? What was your first big paying gig?
Okay, the first gig wasn't big; it was small, but it led to a big gig. And this is the moral of the story. The first call I got from Nike was thanks to a fellow Art Center designer, a graphic designer, and Joe Parsley, whom I worked with in school. And he was from Portland, so he was a home slice, and he had totally dedicated his whole time there to go after the dream job. So we worked together, and sure enough, out of all the people they interviewed in their talent search, they picked up Joe as a young designer straight out of school. So Joe was trying to pull me in, and the first call I get from Joe is not a Nike poster or a print campaign. He's like, man, I'm doing this thing with Bo Jackson, and they have a cereal box for Cheerios he's on. And I'm like, really? So my first shot was a cereal box. I had to search every store in LA because they didn't provide me any cereal box. I had to find one that wasn't damaged from, being knocked by
okay. Yeah.
So the treasure hunt to find the one great box, it turned out, it's just a point of fact is that one of the most difficult initiations for any photographer at Art Center is a box shot, is a product shot. And of course, the instructors are hardcore and it's impossible, and they make you redo it 7 times over if you don't get it exactly right. And here I am as a sports and adventure person going, there's no way in the world I'm going to be shooting a cereal box. And the first call I get is the damn cereal box. So, of course, I took it to heart that was karma, that was, okay, now do it as best you can. I delivered the supreme cereal box shot because that in turn allowed my designer, who was advocating for me, to say, look, you killed on the cereal box shot. Let's do something else. So, in fact, big call was that I was working. I remember exactly what I was doing. I was working for Rolling Stone as an assistant, and they were doing a book of comedy. And so we had a gig at this Disneyland hotel with Spinal Tap. And so I went down that evening with the photographer, Bonnie Schiffman, and I got the call while we were going down, and there was no way to get equipment. They didn't have 24-hour rental houses.
Yeah.
And I said, I turned to Bonnie as we were going down there, and she's like, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? I said, what do I want to do? I'd say I'd shoot them like destroying their hotel room. That would be the shot. I'd take my snap camera and just have them just tear the place apart. And she goes, that's it. That's what we're going to do. Right. And that was that moment I realized, okay, I'm done assisting. If I'm thinking of the shot and doing the shot, that it's my shot, except I don't get credit. And sure enough, that happened to coincide. The planets align, and I get the call to go shoot Bo Jackson for Nike, but I had no gear.
Wow. Okay.
Thank goodness I had, thank goodness, the gratitude and the relationship with Bonnie. And I said, could I borrow the gear just straight out? And she lent me the gear overnight. Okay. I show up at call time, and that was the big break. Bo Jackson doing a commercial. And that was my first shoot for Nike, and it just, everything flowed from there. And that's something I always try to remind myself, is that I might be a beginner. Yeah. That's not necessarily disqualifying. I can always come at it with the same passion and enthusiasm. And even if I'm on a steep learning curve, that's been true of every sport that I've been initiated in, whether it be World Cup soccer or in the case of, Formula One. It's like you definitely start as an outsider and work your way in.
I think another cool thing, super cool, is just this whole Formula One, world and arena. I mean, obviously it's huge globally, probably more so elsewhere than in the U.S., I would almost hazard a bet. What has been your experience there? What was your first shoot there?
Well, I think it's a legacy, right? My grandfather was the first racing fan in our family, and Grandpa Zinno, made the trip to Indianapolis to see the 500 after Mario Andretti won. So Mario's not only a legend, but the fact that he was an Italian American like our family, and that's the family side that I grew up with. So I identified that way. That's he went, and that kind of had an impression on me because he would show the 8mm home movies and this kind of stuff. So it was there in the background the whole time.
Okay.
And I'm the kind of guy that just knew I wanted to be as close as I could to it.
Yeah. And
the question was, well, how close can I get? And So I have a little of a confession to make. Not that I'm advocating this is a great approach for anybody, but I had such a burning desire, and I think that's about drive, to speak to the spirit of this podcast, that I thought, well, I'm nobody at this point. I don't have a body of work to evidence my talent. I'm not a working professional. I'm talking about being 17, 18 years old or something like that. And I just thought I still have to try somehow. So at Long Beach Grand Prix for the Formula One race, they had security at the gate entrances for the pits and this kind of thing, where they would put up the examples of the credentials you needed in order to get in. And being sort of a new event at the time, they didn't have it buttoned down perfectly. So if you waited long enough, at the end of the day, people would go home. Yeah. And I swiped one of the credentials. Mm-hmm. And now I couldn't use it because they had voided it, but what I did is I hand stenciled every part of the graphic design of that entire ticket.
Nice.
And then reversed that to print it, offset, and then hand stenciled that to make a positive print, and created my own credentials. I forged my own credentials to get in there for the first time.
Voila, so, there you go.
I think the statute of limitations is passed on that.
Yeah, all good. I want, we gotta keep.
Yeah, so the thing is, the first image I ever had published was from sitting in the stands at the Canadian Grand Prix, and this is in Montreal. Mm-hmm. And the shot, if you're in the right place at turn 1, 2, you have this onslaught of all 24 cars bearing down in the first turn. And that particular track is famous for a lot of collisions and fights in the first corner. Yeah. And I was just in exactly the right place. And I submitted that shot to the gold standard of the publishing for the sport in an annual called Autocourse. And so it's the year-end yearbook of the best writers and best photographers. Now, I had never been published anywhere and was still in school at Art Center. But I got a package delivered to me around Christmas time. I didn't know what it was. I opened the box, and there's my double-page spread as the centerfold of this annual. Wow. And it was the first time, you talk about big breaks, that was the first time I thought, I can do this. I'm side by side with the people I'm looking at who are, my role models, my heroes in terms of the photography involved. And
that's awesome.
Right on. So that was the year of Senna and Prost. So if you have Grand Prix fans who are on your podcast, you'll know that was another legendary era that I was privileged to be in. I sort of think that it's born at the right time, just to be a kid at that time and then come up at this time with Senna, who is, an absolute hero and probably the greatest of all time in the sport.
And now you've got, full access to all kinds of stuff, which is totally cool. So do you still have a favorite race? I mean, there's so many cool ones out there, but I don't know if you have any favorites, or a couple of them probably.
Well, the ultimate experience in Formula One is to go to Monaco. And it's the opposite extreme from Indianapolis, for example. Mm-hmm. If the U.S. Indy cars look the same, they're open cockpit and so forth, and they couldn't be more different because, for example, the idea of Route 66 was sort of the basis of the American spirit of wide open, full throttle, for hundreds of miles. Now, you go to the opposite extreme in Europe, and you're talking tight and twisty. For example, the track at Monaco has 14 turns with hairpins, 56 gear changes per lap. You might not change the gears at all once you're up to speed at Indy, and you just turn the wheel.
Right, you just go.
A quarter inch to the left. So radically different ideas for the same sport sort of embody the American idea for Indy cars, and Monaco being, the Grand Prix, which is, of course, the sole world championship for makes and drivers. And when you stand for the first time anywhere on the track at Monaco, you realize how impossibly small the track is. So if you've been to Indy like our friend Marshall has, you'll see cars approaching 230 miles an hour, but the scale of the place is so big that you could land 28, without exaggeration, 28 Major League Baseball stadiums on the infield and still have room. So it's massive. So the scale isn't as high as those speeds are. Is not the thing. It's when you're close, and the proximity of being too close. Really, it's kind of intimidating and very sensual. And that when the first car rips past you, the horsepower is delivered through the ground, up through your feet, into your sternum, pounds on your chest, and then of course, the sound, the smell. It's
Yeah,
intoxicating, and
yeah,
it's the kind of narcotic that that I've lived on for a very long time. So if you're going to do one race and say,
yeah.
"What's this all
Monaco.
about?" Monaco's the
All
gem,
right,
the
all right,
crown
yeah,
jewel.
yeah, yeah. Save up my ducats, or I'll have to swipe your badge and make a copy of it, and
Or you
and
can make a fake
get in the
one.
back door. Yeah, yeah. No, that's awesome. Yeah, I've literally been to one or two, Formula One, the American style, where it's just ripping around the track, and yeah,
Yeah.
you're up there. I'm like sticking cotton in my ears is loud, even like way up at the top, but it's like, yeah, it's
Yeah,
gripping to be right there.
music to my ears.
These drivers, I mean, you've gotten to know a bunch of them and you've been in there, and I think you've probably driven one yourself. I mean, talk about these guys as just top athletes. You have to like be so on top of your mental game as well as your physical.
Yeah, when you're as close to the sport as I am, which is that I've spent a great deal of my life, not only loving it but being close to it, and which means that suffering when things go wrong and you lose somebody before their time.
Yeah.
You've touched on something that is actually sort of the bittersweet truth about it, which is that when I was probably 14, 15, one of my first heroes was a Canadian named Gilles Villeneuve.
Hmm.
And, I got into the pits and made pictures of him, but I was always so awestruck by Gilles that
Yeah.
he was the number one Ferrari driver, right? So he was already my hero for a number of reasons, but I never had the nerve to introduce myself. And as sometimes it happens, we lost Gilles, and he
Mm.
was killed in that qualifying crash.
Hmm.
And it bummed me out so bad, Rick. I was in depression for about a year, and I was
Wow.
like 14, 15 years old. I'm like, this isn't going to do. Have
Yeah.
I lost my love of the sport? Do I ever want to go to a Grand Prix again? And it took me a year to figure
Wow.
out that the thing that I regretted the most, which is I never even said hello to him because I put him
Yeah.
up on such a pedestal. And the only reason I recovered out of that was that I made a sacred promise to never let that happen to me again. And that's
Yeah.
kind of the
Yeah.
driving force, right?
That's
I
cool.
didn't give
Yeah.
up on the sport.
Hmm.
Hemingway was playing in my mind because he wrote
Yeah.
about four true sports. This one where he says the four true sports are auto racing, bullfighting, boxing, and mountain climbing,
Mm.
because the rest are
Mm.
merely games. And he's right.
Yeah. I'll tell
He's
you.
right
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
are the maximum consequences. If he was still around today,
Maximum.
Hemingway would probably include big wave surfing. But the thing is that
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
at his time, he was
Adventurous.
talking about
Yeah.
this thing that we acknowledge that this is maximum consequence, maximum commitment. And so
Yeah.
I came back to my love of the sport for the right reason, which is the people in it. And and even when we lose people, it's like Hemingway said about bullfighters. My common sense told me that I shouldn't get involved, I shouldn't be attached, I shouldn't love this bullfighter. And of course, as usual, I didn't listen to my common sense at all, and I fell in love
Yeah.
with the guy. So
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
big love of the people involved, and
Yep.
when we're talking about the rivalries, I mean, there's something about a friend of mine said, racing is really just soap opera for men, right? You've got these guys,
Yeah.
and it's surprising. There's going to be three
Okay.
Grand Prix in the U.S. in Miami,
Wow. Yeah.
Las Vegas, and back in Austin
Yep.
next
Didn't they
year.
just? Okay, next year.
That's
Yeah,
the
they have a
most
couple.
Grand Prix they've ever had in the States because largely of the Netflix series Drive to Survive, which has for the
Wow. Okay.
last 3 years filled people in on exactly these things. The people,
Yeah.
not the machines are magical. They're
Yeah.
they're engineering marvels and they're sculpture to look at,
Yep.
but it's the human factor that's always drawn me. And,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you're talking about some of the mindset, right? What separates the men from the boys, and,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. What is it?
what makes the difference between the good and the great drivers.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, there was a recent poll of current drivers when Schumacher was still running, and they asked, who's the greatest of all time, and even Schumacher, to a man, said Senna was the number one
Mm.
because he was a transcendent figure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you look at that, you say, well, what was so special about somebody like Ayrton Senna from Brazil? He's a three-time world champion. He doesn't have the numbers of Schumacher. He doesn't have as many
Yeah.
wins as Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah.
But there was something about the man's intensity that was zen-like.
Yeah.
And so there's an attraction to, I'll give it to you this way, Rick. Someone once said that we're either molded by our admirations or our hostilities. And
Mm.
so there's
Yep.
something in sport, which includes alpinism and adventure,
Yep.
that when you're drawn towards a certain character,
Mm-hmm.
and pick your favorite.
Yeah.
If you're an alpinist, you can't talk about it without talking about Mesner. If you're a racing fan, you've got to talk about Senna.
Yep.
But to each his own. You could say, well, I prefer Schumacher. And then that tells me something about your sensibilities because Schumacher represents a whole different ideal.
Right. Yeah.
So that's, to me, the real wonderful thing that's universal. And you could be talking World Cup and FIFA and pick your favorite players. It's the same thing. We're looking for reflections of our own values. And even in the case of deciding on our admirations as an influence, those things that we are modeling.
Your reverence obviously comes through, and I know you're a big guy that talks about, about gratitude, and obviously we just talked about mortality and things like that. So I mean, I think this drives what you do. I mean, you're a seeker and a learner, just constant learner. So I know that's just like such a huge ball of wax, but it's something we all deal with, of course, all the time. Not only our mortality, which is can be handcuffing, if not anxiety. Riddling. You have to deal with that in your work too, and on some of your adventures. So what are some of your tips or tricks with just dealing with that aspect of life and just your job too?
If we really want to set ourselves on the right path, it's a matter of considering for a moment how we want to be remembered. And a lot of people are so busy on the track to success that's secondary or even an afterthought. My point is that it's actually, more important to start with that. One of the exercises I offer my startled students is that, have you written your obituary? And they go, what are you talking about? I'm 20-something.
Wow.
I said, no, I want you to take a moment. It's theoretical because I wish all of you long life, but it's something I can't offer these young Jedis that idea unless I've done it myself. Otherwise, I'm a hypocrite to ask them to do something I won't. So I say, look, here's something that's really powerful. If you consider for a moment, how you want to be remembered, you start to build. For example, Rick, everybody's familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, right? It's like, okay, at the bottom, we know for necessity of life, we have food, clothing, shelter. And often people who are more prudish leave off this love and affection because they tie it to sex and they don't want to include that. But food, clothing, shelter, and affection. You show me even an animal that doesn't have love and affection, it turns out differently. And everybody might remember at the top of the same pyramid is self-realization, or as the Buddhists refer to it as nirvana. It's like there's this thing that happens, this illumination, right? But everybody forgets what's in the middle layers of that same pyramid, which is, of course, respect for meaningful work. That's the esteem of your colleagues, right? This is something you cannot attain, this sort of enlightenment or fulfillment or nirvana without working through that. So part of deciding or having the intention of how you want to be remembered includes that essential step. So these are things that I practice and that I would share freely with anybody who's dialing into not just hacking their way through life, but actually tuning their way in a way that is both compassionate and driven, I think is the right way to put it.
As the saying goes, you really got to practice all these things. Practice gratitude, practice intention, practice.
I have one suggestion for people who haven't developed gratitude very well.
Okay. Yeah.
The funny thing is that when you practice something, it can become more and more mindful, right? And so recently I was in a test, an experiment that was a 4-week biotuning experiment, and one of the progressions was being a little bit cold, a little bit hungry, and a little bit out of breath. And the out of breath thing was on the hour. Every hour from 9 to 5, you would actually have an alarm set so that you'd remember to hold your breath. Now it's, this is in the middle of your day, no matter what you're doing. So, if I'm driving my car through traffic and somebody was to look at me and I'd be like holding my breath, just in that exercise, I was so grateful to be able to breathe again after you make a sincere effort to, like, how long can I hold it? Can I work up to a minute or more? And even though that was progressive, I was very grateful to return to breathing freely without the challenge. So I noted that as like, there's like an entry level. If somebody's really unfamiliar with the territory, starting with something as basic, I am grateful for being able to draw my next breath. That's a really good start.
You go way out there sometimes too, and that's again kind of touches upon how we ultimately know each other from our adventure and adventure racing days. And you shoot a lot of super extreme stuff. Not that racing, cars going by you at 200 miles an hour isn't extreme. But, again, I know that I've gained such a amazing insight into not only our own internal powers, let's say, and abilities, like what we're capable of mentally. That probably all wraps into what you do, So if you want to talk about, just going out on some of your really extreme jobs, like a mountaineering expedition, which you've been on. How do you deal with that kind of stuff?
Well, it's true. I find it comforting that we're birds of a feather, right? And that our paths have been overlapping for years, and here we are, going to get to work together this month. I find that comforting, and that if we're doing what we're supposed to be, like, what is my purpose, right? If I'm sort of living up to my potential, if I have any God-given gifts, am I responsible to them?
Yeah.
And I find that the more that I am mindful and taking that responsibility, the more that I end up in good company. I'm in company with you and people like Marshall, who's been a guest on your podcast.
Yeah, Marshall Ulrich.
And certainly in the matter of adventure, it's kind of like, well, yeah, Marshall Ulrich, let me say it out loud. He's the endurance king, the man. If you haven't seen that podcast, go check it out. So what's the entry point, right? It's at one point I was coming up in San Diego. And as you know, Encinitas is probably one of the triathlete capitals of the world.
Yeah.
And it probably shares with Boulder, the same population migrates between the two. So being in sport and in around these community and these athletes, I ended up, going to Ironman Hawaii, and my girlfriend was in the World Championships there. And I remember one of my favorite teachers said, you think Ironman's hard, you should see this thing called the Raid Gauloise, which of course is the queen mother of all adventure races.
Yep.
So it's just being in the path, and then things that are already coming at you. The question is whether or not you sort of open that door when opportunity knocks. And you and I both have been practicing that. I hear the knock, I'm opening the door. I have no idea what's on the other side, and plunging and being able to take that step. So that's how I entered into the world of the Raid and the Eco Challenge early on. Was that it was just a natural progression of like Ironman not being the ultimate, and people in that space testing themselves. Beyond the double and triple Ironmans, which of course is maybe the more linear thing to do, but with more imagination, with somebody like Gerard Fouzy, who is the original French journalist who conceived of this idea and extended from the Kiwis in New Zealand who are doing Southern Traverse. So that became another form of my home away from home, in terms of people like you and Marshall Ulrich and others, Mark Macy, and this company of this gypsies with wanderlust who were adventure, fun hogs. And that's something where, it's just understanding that it's a fulfillment of those desires. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. And again, that's what my goal, I hope, with this podcast is just to show people and have them just say, I can just take the next step, let alone like really pursue my goals. I get it. We all need to work at, what we do. I'm happy and thrilled to have folks like you who do some incredible things. And again, it's motivating, of course, and inspiring. And again, that's all that I can hope to do, is to have people like just feel and feed on themselves and what their own, passions and desires are.
Well, I wanted to mention that sometimes people get stuck in I don't know.
Yeah.
And maybe you've heard it, especially young people who have all the potential in the world. And that's why, I have learned to kind of decode that on occasion, where if it's a refuge where people return to constantly, there is a sincere I don't know, but it should be followed with, but I'm going to look into that. I'm going to dig deeper. I'm going to find out. But if it's constantly returning to the I don't know, there's to me, it indicates a kind of a code for, I think I might have an idea, but I'm not free to say it, or I'm not confident enough to say it. So is the case, if we're trying to liberate people, because it's been done for us before. The reason I teach is that I'm indebted to my greatest teachers. And when I stand up in front of a new class of people I've never met before, I try and start with that name your favorite teacher. How many people here can raise their hand and say they had a best teacher? And almost every hand goes up. I have had people not raise their hand. I'm like, man, you got to get around more.
Yeah.
But it's just when you start listing all the qualities of generosity of spirit, and eventually somebody says encouragement. Man, I love to play with words. And I said, how many words do you see inside encouragement? And they start looking, and it's like, I see courage, I see, and I'm like, look closer. Yeah. Rage. What else? Core. Core, like corazon in Spanish, or cuore in Italian, or cor in French, the rage in the heart. So there's something really fierce about the gift the great teacher gives you in terms of inspiration. It's like, man, I have to do this. It's not really that gentle. And it doesn't matter if you're introverted or extroverted. If you've got a rage in your heart, man, that's a driving force. And so,
right on.
It's a matter of, like, even the greatest, explorer in the Geographic Society history, Sir Richard Burton, who's looking for the source of the Nile. But this is a guy who survived a native attack where a spear penetrated his palate and split symmetrically his jaw open like this. And the pictures of him as an old man still show those vertical scars of the spear going through. Someone asked Sir Richard Burton and said, Sir Richard, why do you do what you do? How do you explain yourself? It's just a guy who translated the Kama Sutra, who broke the neck of 120 languages. I mean, this is an incredible adventurer, and what a life. And his answer was so simple. The devil drives, meaning it was something that was so powerful and compulsive that it was bigger than him. Yeah. So, I mean, I can point all the way back to characters like that and say, what drives, and do I have the heart brave enough to live up to that ambition? That's really the question.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Thank you for that. That's great. You're super passionate, of course, about these awesome things. But is there a particular passion project you have going on, or I mean, you have a lot of stuff that are ongoing, let's say. So I would love to hear a little bit more about your passion project. Yeah.
Well, it's time to strike the middle path, because if we're pulled a certain way by reputation for commercial work, what's the personal, how's it? Daniel Day-Lewis said that when he received some award and Heath Ledger had just passed, and he goes, I just have to accept this word on behalf of Heath Ledger, because watching him work, renews me. And I always remembered that was a brilliant way to give gratitude and be, grateful. But that's the key to any of our lives. If we're busy producing and we're great at it, we might have mastered that routine to be on a treadmill, and the treadmill's on high, and then it's tilting higher and you're running on vertical. Yeah. Okay, at what point do you recover, and at what point do you renew yourself? And so to me, all the passion projects, I've stepped away from racing to do almost something completely the opposite, which is I'm in biodiversity and endangered species and in the natural world with animals that I can't help but fall in love with. And people would say, well, how do you reconcile that? How can you be in both worlds? And I'm like, well, I am in both camps, and I have passions that include these things without prejudice. And so, I think that's sort of the key, is developing that to a point where it's attracting people because they have recognized that this is what you're doing. So there's a more attraction involved than self-promotion. And you could see maybe even in your own career where commercial work tends to be tilted towards promotion. Yep. And for me, I'm just really satisfied when the attraction's there based on the previous work. So that includes self-assignments. If I want to go shoot cheetahs in Africa and I can't get Nat Geo to get me to do it, well, maybe I just need to go and do a discovery trip and see what I come back with. Yeah. And if that's the case, then turn that out to the world, reflect my take on it. And then the people who relate to it are probably most likely the people who share the sensibilities, the ethics, and maybe even the aesthetics, so that we're building our own community through the right way, which is the attraction. The closer we get to, being immersed, if you're so close to something that there's little or no separation, you have an affinity for the subject, and that's the ideal. And in the case of cheetahs in South Africa, we were we were working with Dr. Lori Marker at the Cheetah Conservation Fund, CCF, and they're remarkably, doing just brilliant work. So I'd be happy to plug them anytime that we can.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Your process. I mean, when you work with so many, like I said, top amazing folks around the world in various sports. Do you have a specific way that you engage? You just try to be yourself, or like how is it to literally engage these folks? Could just help folks, understand like some ways to know how to deal with people that we might want to, put ourselves in front of, let's say, or, how to even ask for a raise, because we're all, get that sort of feeling around our bosses sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Rick. I think the best way to answer that is that if I'm stepping into a new situation, whether it's directing or whether it's being a stranger in a strange land, I like to invoke the spirit of someone like Maya Angelou, who said famously that when she's called to speak or go to the podium or direct, she takes a moment to herself and asks all the people who are ever kind to her, living or dead, to come now. I need you. I need you. I need your strength. And that invocation of not only her elders but the kindness is really empowering. And it removes that kind of stage fright for me in any situation, no matter how big, no matter how large the job or the size of the crew or how famous the person is. And it helps, of course, that I had some history in working in Hollywood, where I got to meet a lot of A-list celebrities and my favorite actors and these kinds of things, because then you start to see the humanness in them. And I'll tell you a secret about the biggest of the big stars is that if you're an A-list celebrity, you really are hungry and almost desperate for somebody just to be straight with you, straight across, and not be awestruck. And the lower you go, B, C, D celebrities, the more self-important they become, and the more vicious their sort of support staff in terms of publicists and those kind of animals. But you've already got your finger on it. Your intuition is really sharp, because if for example, I enter a room where I might be excited or nervous to meet somebody I really admire, I always say, well, is my motive good? I check my motive. I'm prepared. I'm professional. I've earned this position. I didn't win it in the lottery. I'm supposed to be here. And I sort of calm myself and I invoke that memory of Maya Angelou's inspiration. And I just show up. And then no matter if that person's a prima donna or a terrible diva, it doesn't reflect on me. I'm there for the right reason. And when you move, I was at my friend, a Nat Geo photographer, Rob Clark, whom I came up with, said, just move with love, which is so succinct. Even before you've said anything to somebody, if they see you across the room, I might be holding the camera in my hand on a set, someone backlot in Hollywood, or I might not. But if I'm moving with love to do no harm, think about that. Those are two powerful, short, succinct sentences. Move with love, do no harm. Then it's a lot like, for the lack of a better expression, working with traumatized horses, which my wife and I do every week. And it's a matter of, I've learned more about my human relationships through traumatized horses, because they're asking those same questions. Are you going to do me harm? And even if you're the subject of a photograph, there's some question about, are you going to make me look bad? So in that respect, if you can extrapolate from that, this sort of peaceful, neutral, loving, I'll give you one example. The compliment that's come back from people in different places and times that's almost the same is that, that shot we did? I'm like, yeah, because if you're working well, you're going to return to some of the same people over the course of years because there's good relationship. And I'm like, yeah, what about that shot? And they're like, well, it's not my favorite, but my mother loves it.
Mom loves it.
And I thought,
all right.
I've heard this from so many people that I thought, is it something I'm doing? What am I doing? I'm mothering these people. I'm loving. I'm seeing them the way their mother sees them.
I say capturing the essence. That's to me that says you've captured their essence, because who knows better your essence than your mom, right?
Yeah, I'll take that compliment every day, because it's quite a high one, I think, and it doesn't go to their vanity maybe as much, because their vanity might be more vaulted, and that's fine. We could. It's like Dan Arbus said about portraits. The great thing about portraits is that, for example, if you're shooting me, Rick, I might have an idea of my good side or whatever, my ideal self. And you might even look at me and say, well, I know I want to do this with Tony, but the camera is the best instrument invented to step into the gap in between. And if you're both working well, then you can both be surprised by the new thing that you find.
Yeah.
So I like to invoke Arbus in that spirit, but hopefully that's not too far off topic.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, that's great. I mean, she's one of the, legends as well. If anybody needs to know, I mean, she was an amazing, sort of social commentary, docu-style photographer. Yeah, I mean, legendary for sure.
Legend.
So, yeah. Perfectly on topic, I would say. Yeah, so I'm sure folks will know some of these names and not, but I mean, wow, we've certainly covered a lot from mountaintops to Monaco, which is awesome. And thank you for all your insight and your passion and your gratitude, and makes me want to be a more conscious person. I know that again we all work on it every day. The kids, got the young kids. I'm sure a lot of folks out there do. They drive you a little crazy. You become unconscious. Let's call it that. But no, thank you. And this is awesome.
I just have a postscript here, which you can keep in or out as you like. But it's a matter of a challenge, for people who are driven on your podcast. And I found one of the most powerful exercises that we can do that is extremely personal is a top 10 list. And 10 is an arbitrary number, and other people would call it a bucket list. But I found it really relates to that emerging of what might be your internalized passion and externalizing it by citing, for example, who are the 10 people in the world that you're fascinated with, interested in, want to meet. And it's not about people who have left the planet already. It's really people who are actually still here that you're connected to, whose work moves you. And it could be anybody from athletes to actors to, writers. It's just your list.
Yep.
And above and beyond that, not only those people, but the places you need to go. Is there any place in the world that you can name fires your imagination? You may not even know why, but if you can list, and 10 is just a number. I know some people list 2 or 3 things, and that's remarkable. Other people list 20 or 30 things, and that's also interesting. But 10 is just a number to get you rolling, right? And so not only that, but the things you need to do before you shuffle off this mortal coil. So there's 3 lists right there. The people that you're interested, the places you must go, and the things you must do. And if you're doing this in a really deliberate, serious way, you'll find people, places, and things that you must emerge in your mindfulness, your consciousness. Yeah. And that becomes something of an intention and a desire. So I found that that's much more useful and even powerful rather than just keeping it inside and unspoken, unmanifested. And then if you do these things in a sincere way, and it's like Hemingway wrote when people asked, what's your process, maestro? How do you do what you do? I mean, and he took a long, pregnant pause, and he said famously, I just wait for one true thing. And that's what I would suggest and submit to anybody doing this exercise, to sit and wait and see what bubbles up. And if it's in you, give it a chance to come. And then I like handwriting these kind of things. It doesn't matter how you get it out, but handwriting seems to be a powerful kind of thing. And then if it works well, you'll see that you've got people, places, and things you must do, and they might even overlap. And if they do, you can share that list discreetly with those who love and support you and actually recognize this ambition as a good one. Don't share this indiscriminately with people who are naysayers. There's enough of that around. But that would be my 2 bits, is to be brave, sit quietly, and see what comes up, and get those things out of your head and heart and through your hand in a place where you can look at it.
Awesome. I love it. Head, heart, camera. Those are the 3 things we need. Well, again, Tony, thank you so much. It's been awesome. Thrilled to go through all this kind of stuff. I'm sure we could talk for a couple more hours on all this stuff. Unfortunately, maybe we'll have to do part 2 out on the road, as we just talked about, out on Route 66. We'll come back and revisit all this kind of stuff. But thank you, beautiful. Gratitude to you for all of this, and I'm sure folks will certainly get a lot out of this one, and we'll see you down the road, literally.
Right on, buddy. Thanks for all you do.